Welcome to Sustainable Sessions, hosted by yours truly, Lucas and Lauren. Episode 25, featuring Benjamin Von Wong.
My name is Benjamin Von Wong. I'm an artist and activist. I've generated over 100 million views for different causes like fast fashion, ocean plastics, and electronic waste. The work that I do sort of lies on the intersection of fantasy and impact, and I try to create work that strikes conversations up, right? I want people to look at my stuff and wonder, like, what am I looking at? Is it real? Is it fake? And that creates a conversation for people to go, well, what am I looking at? And I can say how it was done, and then most importantly, why. And so I see my role as an artist to widen the funnel, to allow people to kind of get interested in a topic that they may not normally care about. So not competing against, say, a Nat Geo or any one of those amazing documentary photographers or anything like that, but rather just trying to, use my own voice to create conversations in another way.
Incredible, great introduction. I guess just to dive right into that, what's kind of like your background and how did you get into like art and specifically the type of art you make? Like, obviously, some people are more like into digital art and stuff like that. Like, how did you pick the mediums that you kind of landed on, and kind of what's your background and all that?
Yeah, totally haphazard, actually. I have a background in hard rock mining engineering. So
wow.
I'm Canadian, and I went to university here in Montreal, Quebec. And so when I went to university, I was 17 years old. So at 16, I went to the open house, and you're like, oh, what do you want to do for the rest of your life? I'm like, I have no freaking idea. And I'm like, I'm Asian, I'm good at math, I'm good at physics. Like, what else am I going to do? I'm just going to do engineering. And so the folks at the mining booth had the best sales pitch. They're like, you get paid the most, you get to travel everywhere, you got the smallest classrooms, you have paid internships. And I was like, oh, this sounds wonderful. And so anyways, I graduated hard rock mining engineering back in like 2008 or something. And even before I graduated, I was like, oh, this is not what I want to do with my life. But I didn't have anything better planned. Mm-hmm. So I just, worked for 3.5 years. While like in 2007, I bought my first camera. So right before I graduated on my last work term, I was working in a mine in Winnemucca, Nevada, and a girl broke up with me. And I was like, oh no, what am I going to do with myself? I'm not even 21. So wait, like keep in mind, I went from being legal drinking age, which is 18 in Canada, to not legal drinking age in a small, tiny town of 10,000 people. There's literally nothing to do except to hang out in the Walmart. And this girl breaks up with me, and I'm like, shit, what am I going to do with myself? Like, I need to find a hobby. And the stars were pretty, and I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to take pictures of the stars. I'm going to teach myself how to take pictures. And the camera became a companion. It was something for me to do wherever I was. It was a conversation starter at a party. It was a backstage access pass at an event, right? Like having a camera just gave me a life, or access to life in a way that I never had prior. And that's sort of what got me sucked down that rabbit hole. So by day, I was an engineer. On the evenings and weekends, I was doing photography. I started off doing events, weddings, everything like that. It was like, I was like, wow, you can get paid to have fun. This is wonderful. But over time, it became a second job. And then I slowly had like engineering and photography. And I was like, wait, the plan was never to have two jobs. The plan was to have one job and one hobby. So what am I doing here? And I decided to just start doing creative photography, doing fantasy shoots, small little sets. And things just got crazier and crazier. In 2012, I woke up, I guess I just woke up one day and I was like, oh man, I don't know what I want to do with my life. I still don't know. It's been 3.5 years. I still don't know what I want to do with my life. But I know it's not engineering. Like, I didn't really want to be an artist. I think it was viewed as a step down on the social ladder from engineering, which also already wasn't that great because it wasn't a doctor or a lawyer. And so I was like, what else am I going to do? And so I figured I'd just quit my day job. I was going to get an MBA. So I got my GMAT and sat for the test and got all this stuff. And I was like, all right, well, I have a little bit of time before the next application season starts. Let's just travel. And I realized that I could travel for free as a photographer. All I had to do was, say that I was going to go somewhere to teach, and then I'd have a plane ticket to go teach some photography, lead a workshop, and then suddenly I have friends because now I was talking to a bunch of people, and then with that I could travel. And so I just kind of bounced from place to place. And eventually, I guess to accelerate the story a little bit, I figured out how to make a living as an artist, and in 2015 landed the biggest commercial career of my life, where I earned more money in this one job than my entire career combined up to that point. And I was like, I've made it. This is it. This is what it feels like to get paid to do what you love. And it was kind of disappointing. It felt pointless. It was like, well, what happens next? I just get a bigger job with a bigger client, to sit in more meetings, to move more product off of shelf. Like, is that it? Is that like life? And I almost quit photography over that. I just kind of felt like I had plateaued, and that it was getting a little bit boring and redundant. And I started documentary filmmaking. I thought that was the way that I could have an impact on the world. It was by telling real stories of real people who needed real help. But that didn't last too long, because I realized, like, if you're just always telling sad stories, life is kind of sad. So then began the quest of figuring out, how do you tie fantasy and, real world documentaries together. And I guess I have to give some credit here to my girlfriend. She was the the lead environmentalist in our relationship for a long time. And I was just the dude, the dude that wanted to do cool things. And she recommended that I do a campaign where we use storms as a metaphor for climate change. And that was like my first kind of storm chasing for climate change awareness project. And as a result of saying yes to do a project like that, you kind of have to like learn about the issue before you talk about it. And so I started watching documentaries, and then I started getting sucked down the sustainability rabbit hole. And then one thing led to another. And now here we are a couple years later, and I am, I guess, an environmentalist and an activist, and, I'm vegan and doing the things. So that's the synopsis.
Wow, but there's like, that's such a crazy story too, because I feel like you had your creative side, and then how the sustainability part kind of got integrated into that is so unique and different than I think how a lot of us kind of fall into our sustainability journeys. And so is there a particular kind of niche within climate change that really resonates with you, or do you find, like, as you're doing research for some of these different projects that you're working on, you're learning about different problems, and it's just kind of a bit of everything?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess first off, I'm like a reluctant environmentalist. I I never started off with like a huge love for nature. I actually am very much a city kid. I like my internet. I'm a homebody. I don't go out that much. I'm quite comfortable with my AC at home and so forth. And so becoming an environmentalist was sort of like, I was dragged into it kicking and screaming, where I was just like, I don't like, this is so inconvenient. It's so inconvenient to be an environmentalist. And because the more, the more restrictions you have on how you're supposed to live your life. And but it reaches a point where I think when you stop just seeing things, and you start actually looking at them and understanding them and realizing why they're actually an issue, that you can't turn the other way. And so the direction I came at sustainability from was really this sort of reluctant city kid. As far as like which issues I champion, I think it's sort of the same thing. So basically, when you're an artist, and maybe this is the same when you're a human being, and you start getting good at something, you start getting known for something, then the whole world conspires for you to do that same thing over and over again. Like, people don't want you to do anything else. And so you get put into a box. And the box that I sort of fell into, and it was really cool to fall into the box initially, because you're like, oh, I found like this niche and I can do things. But then after that, you do it once, twice, three times, and you're like, all right, I want to get out of this box now. And you're like trapped because you can't get out. So the box that I've fallen into is like overconsumption, right? So I have created a ton of photo shoots and art installations around consumption by using waste as a material. So basically, I'm like a trash artist. And it was like, but I never set out to be a trash artist. Actually, I don't even know how to build anything. I'm not a builder yet. Somehow, because I've created these campaigns that were so successful, I've kind of fallen into this niche. Now, that is not to say that I don't believe overconsumption isn't a worthy cause. It's just that I am interested by the spectrum of issues that affects us. And I don't think you solve one without the other. Like, you don't solve environmentalism without also tackling like social justice, while also tackling poverty. Like, you have to pay attention to each and every one of these things. And I think that this default way we tend to be slotted into categories is part of the problem. So, so I'm known for certain things. I don't believe that what I am best at is the most important. And I'm generally interested in always learning more and figuring out how to interweave different concepts together.
That was very interesting, and I think like that topic of intersectionality is a theme that we've now seen with a lot of different people that we've had on the podcast, and it's a very common thread because, like you said, you really can't successfully solve one of these problems without solving the others, or at least coming in conflict with some of these other items. To kind of backtrack a little bit on this idea or the notion of being kind of put in a box and trying to expand those horizons, I find it very interesting when you build it off your initial story where you were kind of put in this commercialized box where you were, you know, like you said, you can make an incredible living and most people would be happy with having that option to do something that they love. Can you talk a little bit about like what you found unfulfilling from that experience and kind of what you find fulfilling now about the new work that you've done and kind of where you see yourself going in the future and kind of how that gives you drive and purpose to go through with that?
I think when you pursue something for the sake of doing it, like a personal feat, and you achieve it, very often when you reach that point, it's less fulfilling than you anticipated it to be, right? Like you work, like you just crossing the finish line of a marathon will only last you for X amount of time. It's just like it's a slice of time. And so I think what makes something rewarding and lasting is what comes as a result of that. Like what are the ripple effects of what that accomplishment has led to? And so when I go out and I have a lot of money and I create this, you know, photograph, but it doesn't really do anything. Like I'm not feeling the impacts of that thing I've created. All I'm seeing is like, okay, my bank account is fuller and now I can buy a couple more things and I can make more decisions in my life. Like that's fine, but that's just like, but couldn't that have happened any number of other ways? And so when you start doing things that actually have like purpose and meaning behind it, then there's more pride that comes into it, right? Because now you can see this image being used as a symbol, or you can see how it's affecting someone's life in a different way. Like the feedback loop is radically different. And I think although it is immeasurable, like it's truly qualitative, the impact that these things have. That's where like our source of our true source of pride, I think, comes from. When you feel proud about an accomplishment, it comes from a place of like deep humanity. And so your ability to connect and serve others and generate something that is valuable, and that exchange of energy is where you feel as a human being more complete than otherwise. And I think that's why this idea of pursuing success on a purely like business and financial route just doesn't quite hit home.
No, that was awesome. And I think that's something that Lauren and I can definitely relate to as well. Like, you know, we both were business students, and I think the common theme that you're seeing in a lot of classrooms, let's say, you know, 20 years ago, was focusing primarily on the bottom line as a true metric for success. And it was less about making impact. Whereas I know even from my graduating class, we're about 3 years apart. Lauren's class and kind of the newer generation that's coming in, there's a huge emphasis on profit with purpose, or businesses that the other term would be like social capitalism, like those type of concepts where you're using a private entity as a driving force in the market, but it's less focused on metrics such as the bottom line and a lot more focused on what are the impacts we can making. If money is a byproduct, you know, you're going to start seeing that as well, but that's never the driving focus. And I think even what we're trying to do with this podcast and our own business, and you know, a lot of the social entrepreneurs we speak with, it's really motivating to hear their perspectives on it, especially someone like yourself who's gone the direction and told us, you know, the grass isn't greener when you get there. Really, it's not as satisfying. Stick on this pathway, and you'll be a lot more fulfilled in your life. And you know, maybe you don't hit the same monetary success as you would gone the other ways, but at the end of the day, like, you know,
you're still living a good life in a sense, because you're doing something that means something to you and the world around you.
Yeah, I actually want to disagree a little bit on the not hit the same monetary success piece of the puzzle, though. I actually think that I have greatly benefited from a personal brand and opportunity perspective from having shifted my work from one that was just about doing cool, pretty things to now doing something with a lot of meaning and purpose. I would argue that a great number of the conferences I've been invited to speak at, stages I've been paid a lot of money to attend, or even the scale and scope of the projects that I'm able to do today, you know, they also come with money. And so sticking to something and believing in it and trying to tackle an issue that is actually solving a problem is very generative in that way. And there is such a demand and a hunger for solutions, and that I actually don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think maybe an interesting way to think about it is like, have you guys read Adam Grant's book, Give and Take? He, yeah, so he basically portrays like three kinds of human beings in the world. There's the givers, there's the people who are transactional, and then there's the people who are takers. And on the top of the rung, you have the takers, but you also have the givers. In the middle, you have the folks that are transactional, and on the bottom, you have both the givers and the takers. Except the evolution curve of these three personality types is very different. So the giver stays on the bottom of the rung for a really, really long time until that all those like seeds that they planted helping others before helping themselves eventually like pay off, and then they just shoot to the top faster than like anyone else can. And then they end up like above like the takers. The takers rise faster than everyone else, but they also fall harder than anyone else, because if they're burning bridges along the way to get that success, they crash and burn. And the transactional people is just like one to one, right? So serendipity never favors them because they're just exchanging value. It's a very linear growth process. And I think it might be a little bit similar when we look towards sustainability and creating creating businesses or art or anything of that, for that matter, that is trying to generate value. Is like it takes a lot more time to set up. You're asking a lot more of the right questions, and it feels a lot slower because you're seeing all these other people rocketing ahead. But ultimately, if at the end of the day you're creating greater value with more resilience, that has more community built in, with more stakeholders that are part of that equation, it can only be more robust in the long run, right? And that's something that we've actually seen. It's one of the reasons why like all these large impact, like all these even large fund managers like BlackRock and so forth are starting these impact funds that have a huge focus on ESG, is because we're seeing the long-term impacts of these kinds of things. So it's more, I think it's more a question of like, are you thinking for the short term? Are you thinking for the long term? And invariably, we may feel like we're being left behind very often, and I certainly not immune to it, but I feel a lot of pride in what I do more so than I used to, and I think that's worth something.
Yeah, no, that was awesome. And I'll definitely want to, Lauren and I will definitely check out that book because that's a great analogy and way to put it. And I think to build on that, I totally agree with the notion that a lot of these like market opportunities, if you want to think from like a long-term point of view, like climate change is no question, like even if you want to just look at it from an economic point of view, this incredible opportunity, like this real blue ocean opportunity for someone who's, looking to start a business and you're trying to determine where should I kind of go. It's a very unsaturated type of market that has so much potential because we have so many problems ahead of us. And I think that's something like even us, when we're thinking about our pavement business, we're marketing it one sense very environmentally, and like that's something that's a huge pillar of what the product that we're trying to put out into the market. But beyond that, we're always including the economic value. So if we can use recycled waste material that's going to offset the costs and now make it more attractive for the market, we're hitting multiple birds. It doesn't always have, like going on what you were saying, it doesn't always have to be mutually exclusive. Oftentimes when you find that intersectionality with economics and environmental impact, you're going to have a real home run solution that you could bring forward to the market, and you'll reach that type of success because it's checking so many boxes. Like how could you argue against it when it's a better quality product, better for the environment and also economically better as well? And I think that oftentimes there is a lot of intersect there.
Yeah, and you're also addressing a growing market, right? So if you think about it, you have, yes, consumer demand, which may or may not affect government things, probably might at least influence it. You have waste as a raw material that is growing in volume, so the costs go down, right? Economies of scale. You have the fact that we have, I don't know how many miles of road in the world that needs maintenance and rehabilitation. There is like the climate policies and the carbon policies that are coming into place. And so you have all these extraneous factors. And so if all of this is like creating pressure on a system, and you're able to offer like, I don't know, the juice that comes out of it as a result of all this pressure, then it can only be valuable. So I don't know. And even the failure of initiating a project like that will create value in its exploration of the limits and the boundaries of what is possible, because that paves the way for all those to come, because we learn from the mistakes of others, we learn from the stories of others. And so it's just so much more exciting of a space to be in than, I don't know, creating yet another fashion brand. Like really, like, does the world need a new t-shirt with a new design? It's really not going to make a difference.
That's incredible, and I think that's something that Lauren and I like. It keeps us sane on this journey that we're going through because of how exciting it is. So like, yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty, and from a lot of people that might make them feel uncomfortable. But for us, like, we're just so curious. We're so excited to hear the next answer, and if it's not right, we're gonna pivot, hit a new roadblock, and go somewhere else. But we're really pioneers in this space, and I think that's what makes it so attractive for us because there's always something new on the horizon. And in the long run, if things pan out the way they should, we really will make quite a dent of impact on the planet as well, and that's what keeps us super energized as we go through it.
And climate change isn't just going to magically go away. We still have to deal with it kind of head on because it's coming at us at a really rapid pace. So if we're not making these solutions and acting now, or even having these conversations now, we're really going to be far behind, which is really scary to think about.
Yeah. I was talking so I interviewed Michelle Thaler on my podcast, who's a NASA scientist, and she's like the head of communication of one department or another. But anyways, she says, the thing that everyone is forgetting is that regardless of what we do at this point in time, we've already caused enough damage that the sea levels are going to rise by a certain amount. And the sea level rise and the climate disruption that is happening is going to displace 1 billion people by the end of this century, regardless of what we do now. Like if we stopped today, that is still going to happen. And so no one's asking the big question of like, how are we going to move 1 billion people? And how are we going to deal with all the political strife, the socio-economical strife that is going to come as a result of that? And, and it's not an opinion, it's like backed by data. It's just that it's an inconvenient truth that no one really wants to pay attention to. So, I mean, there's no shortage of problems in the world to tackle and figure out how to contribute to it. But like in 50 years from now, if you're just sitting at a big desk earning lots of money when the whole world is burning around you, I don't think you're going to feel good about yourself. I just think most people wouldn't be really excited about living that kind of a life. So leading with values first, I think, is ultimately the best way to position yourself, because just because you choose one day to like switch from doing something just for profit and then turning your head and doing something just for impact, it doesn't mean that the world is going to accept you. If anything, I think many people aren't ready to accept that transition. And I can give like just a personal story here. So when I switched from 2015 to 2016, right, I decided that I wanted to do more impact stuff. I thought that I could just take all the career success that I had like creating these fantastical surreal campaigns and move them into the nonprofit space. So I like went around, I knocked on doors and I was just like, hey, I'd love to work for you for free. I don't need anything. I was like turned down everywhere because people weren't looking for free work. They were looking for people who could actually solve problems. In order to solve a problem, you need to understand the situation. And if you're not going to take the time to like learn and to listen, your skills are not just immediately transferable. So like, even if you're a big shot somewhere, there's still a little bit of that transitional curve. And so it's best to get started now. Even if it's a slow transition. I know not everyone is in the position of privilege of being able to just drop their day job and move on, but now is a really good time to, at the very least, start getting educated, because one day your kids are going to ask you that question. One day your friends are going to start asking you those questions, and they'll be asking you why you just sat around and didn't do anything and didn't care.
No, it's interesting that you bring that up too. And I find, and maybe we can kind of like head more into your work. I find with showing the problems or just showing the solutions, there's still this gap in terms of how all these different statistics are being demonstrated and showed to people. Because I think if you're only showing solutions, people think, oh, well, someone else is working on it. I don't necessarily have to get involved and like put efforts towards being more sustainable. But then on the other side, when you're only showing the problem, I feel like that just gets people kind of down in their feels and they're like, oh my gosh, and a lot of that eco-anxiety comes up. So kind of what are your thoughts on how we can bridge that gap? Because I feel like you're already somewhat doing that, like you said, how you're bridging the fantasy with the problem. Yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
It's what a big problem with no clear answer. I mean, clearly, let's just take a step back and think of the market forces at work, right? So if you're a startup with a solution, you're going to be pouring your marketing dollars into talking about this solution. Mm-hmm. And so this story is going to surface. If you're like a fund manager or an accelerator, like what the World Economic Forum does, they tell all these stories of hope because it fits their brand and they want people to feel inspired to take action. Like those are going to produce one set of narratives. You have all the activists on the other side who are really trying to get corporations to be more accountable. And so they're telling all these dreadful stories of that the world is going to complete crap and we're not changing fast enough, so we're doomed. And then you have the brands themselves who are telling their little narratives of hope about the like 1% change that they've made in this year's like policy. in order to make sure that their kind of their shareholders feel like they're doing something. And then you have the news. The news is just excited by anything that's dramatic and crazy and out of this world, and they don't care about what the consequences of those are. And so regardless of like what the right one is, I feel like there's always going to be competing narratives at work because the market is asking for these competing narratives. I think maybe the thing to think about is like, which kind of stories are you interested in telling? What kind of narratives do you want to see in the world? Like, if you feel like there is a lack of narratives of hope, then go tell narratives of hope. If you feel like there's a lack of awareness in something, go tell those narratives. I don't think there's any one right or wrong narrative. At least in the world that we live in today, there's no singular voice out there that's going to solve everything. And more often than not, if you think there is only one way forward, you're probably part of the problem. Because there are like, those are like the thought leaders of the world who say, if only the entire world thought this way, the world's problems would be solved. And we know always that that's like a very myopic view of the world, and it's never true. So the question is really like, what stories do you want to tell? What kind of future do you want to live in? And how are you going to contribute to it? And rather than think about like, oh, I'm going to go in and I'm going to change the world, I can tell you that's like a path to misery. Just because I've created campaigns that have had the tens of millions, the hundreds of millions of views, and it's like, but what has changed? I'm like, I don't know what has changed. So like, if you set your bar to something amorphous that could never be measured, you're not going to be able to measure it. But if you set your bar kind of smaller and you say, I want to tell a global story, because stories are timeless. They're new to anyone who hasn't discovered them yet. I mean, if you just watched a video of mine that you had never seen before, it would be just as exciting today as it was 4 years ago. But that being said, think of also which community you can affect change with. Like, who are the solution makers on the ground, and how can your narratives tie into something that is actually like measurable, quantifiable, whether that's moving a petition forward, maybe whether it's moving policy forward, whether it's moving technology forward. It doesn't really matter, but make sure you have an idea of what kind of outcome are you actually working towards, and don't make it like, oh, I want world peace, because it's just not. That's not a goal. That's just like, I don't know, a pipe dream, really.
No, that's really well said, and it's a very holistic perspective that you're looking at the world with all these different driving forces. And I think that's obviously, I'm not saying you're old, but I'm saying you definitely have a very you definitely have a very mature, wise perspective that I think we're going to see a lot of our
that
younger
we need more of.
Yeah, and I think a lot of our younger audience, like sometimes they are very fixated and narrow-minded, where they watch one video and it's like, this is now the holy grail, and this is like the message I need to push forward, without stopping and looking at these other forces that are always going to be impact. And I think that's something, as organizations, particularly like our company and other types of profit for purpose companies, when we look at the impact that we're trying to make, that very much can be also tied with the markets that you're approaching. So I know we're from Canada, so we're trying to do pilot projects right now in Canada and in North America, just from a proximity standpoint. But when we look at opportunity, really, South America, India, China, a lot of these emerging BRIC economies that have much deeper waste problems than we have here, and are in need of a lot of infrastructure as their economies start growing for driving and automobiles and everything. Like, those are markets that we would love to get into and be our main focal point, because we're going to make a lot of impact, and there's so much more opportunity there than kind of simultaneously, it's got a global level, it'd be awesome, but like, we have to be mindful of our time and our pathway to kind of enter these various markets. One question I have for you, just because you're so well spoken and your thought process on a lot of this, what are some like types of like books, and this doesn't even have to be like climate specific, but just kind of what are some like authors or books or podcasts that you digest on a regular basis that have kind of formed the way that you think and you kind of perceive the world? Because I'd love to like listen to a lot of these, like, just to gain
your critical thinking is just unreal.
Maybe it's the engineer in you too, like, who knows, but like, I'm just kind of curious, like, or what has been some big pieces of content that have really influenced you, maybe like from when you were younger to even now, that we can kind of share forward to the audience and even for ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, I can name drop a couple books. So I know a lot of marketing books, like Contagious by Jonah Berger, Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath, Story Brand by Donald Miller are examples of telling stories in a way that people want to share them. beyond that, I also, so this idea of intellectuals versus thought leader comes from a book called The Ideas Market. How, I don't know the full name. I think it's How Plutocrats, Pessimists, and wait, let me find the name. Oh, here. So the concept of this thought leader versus intellectual piece of the puzzle actually comes from a book called The Ideas Industries, How Pessimists, Partisans, and Plutocrats Are Transforming the Marketplace of Ideas. It's a super dense read, but it's quite interesting. There's a book called Winners Take All by Anand Giridharadas that's really fascinating, that talks about the role and responsibility of companies and how they need to concentrate on doing, instead of saying trying to do more good, try to do less harm. That I really like. I don't know though, like I think the reason I have this line of thinking is less a byproduct of a single book and a byproduct of the fact that I get the opportunity to be in rooms with very different people all the time. And in the past, what that meant was getting invited to speak at conferences where like I would literally be the only artist around, and listening to people from completely different industries that had nothing to do, sometimes nothing to do with conservation, and just being curious and listening. And so, you know, when I think of like a platform like Clubhouse and its potential to open people up to new ideas, if they were actually focused on listening instead of speaking about themselves, I just see it as a tremendous opportunity to learn and expand your mind and your view of the world, and figure out how all these different ideas that are floating around the world, how they can apply to what you're doing. So perhaps the question is, how can you upgrade your own thinking? What are the spaces you can put yourself in to upgrade your own thinking? And you know, it's funny because that you think that I'm super articulate and well spoken. You know, when I go into rooms on Clubhouse, I spend most of my time feeling completely inadequate and feeling really dumb and being like, oh my gosh, like I have so much to learn. This is terrible. Like, how do I contribute to the world? And so I think we all have those same insecurities and discomforts when we find ourselves in spaces where we know a lot less. And of course, it's easy to sound a little bit smart now because we're taking, I mean, I hope I learned something in 34 years of being alive, that I can actually talk for an hour and not sound like completely dumb. So, you know, I think there's a certain amount of storytelling here, where I'm in a position to answer questions in a way that is interesting to you guys.
That's great, and I think it's really humbling too to have that perspective. I think oftentimes, like, I honestly prefer to be the dumbest in the room when I'm surrounded by people that are smart, because you have to have that perspective that, you know, take away the ego and the arrogance and being like, oh, I have to be the expert here talking, like, and really open your mind up to hearing new ideas. I think that's like fundamental to the success of these platforms, but overall humanity in this digital age, to be able to distill some information. And I was actually watching a very interesting TikTok, but they were talking about this kind of notion where there's we're starting to see influencers and thought leaders and these items almost as filters to the massive influx of information that's going through the world. And we really, when we think about brands and individuals in particular, we kind of like, okay, this person's an expert in this field because of X, Y, and Z they've done, and, you know, their thoughts on it. I'm going to go to them for their information and trust them as a source. Whereas in the past, you know, our parents, even before the internet, it was kind of like, let's go to authoritative figures, but, you know, there wasn't other information available that we could even compare it to. Whereas now we're going to these leaders and being like, okay, well, where did you siphon your information from? Like, why should we trust you, kind of thing. And so to kind of build on all of that and tie it into a question for Clubhouse and other platforms that might emerge in the Clubhouse space, how, like, and maybe this is something you're struggling with too, talking about, like, how do we provide like authority to some of these people? Like, should it be almost like Reddit, where Reddit has kind of like leaders in certain categories, and they almost act as moderators to ensure that, and I know that kind of exists in Clubhouse, but where do you kind of see it going in the next few years, let's say, to ensure that there's good quality information out there and leaders that are in the right seats to ensure the conversations are going correctly, I guess?
I mean, I think very often we look to technology for solutions when maybe we just have to look to people, right? Like, it's up to us to also like take responsibility for being better judges of character. And so like a warning sign is someone who's spending all of their time speaking instead of listening. How are they responding to others in the room? Like, what are they saying, and how are they tying it to other topics? And are they being relevant, or are they just being repetitive? Right? When you take someone like Gary Vaynerchuk as an example, not to pick on someone, but like Gary drives me crazy in that not because he doesn't have any valuable insights and advice to provide, but he just feels to me like a parrot. He's always repeating the same message and mantra, and you can log on and listen to him on any talk, any podcast, any clubhouse room, and he would be talking about the exact same thing every single time. And so people like that are what I would categorize into thought leader category. And I just don't find them very interesting. I find it a lot more interesting to discover people who are not preaching, but rather discovering. And I think as a listener, it's uncomfortable to be in that space because you're consistently resetting you're resetting yourself, and you're like, oh wait, I'm dumb again because I haven't built any scaffolding from previous conversations. But that's not actually true. You're building more diversity of perspective. So you're building out wide instead of building up tall. So my fear actually with like influencers on TikTok and so forth is that they're taking really complex issues and they're potentially diluting it down into like a 45-minute thing that's really just small and condensed. And that doesn't give people the opportunity to really judge the validity of it, because now you're making something that is potentially very complex and you're making it very snappy and marketable and quick and easy to digest. But easy doesn't mean good. Easy just means like it's sort of you're digesting it in the simplest way possible. So you're automatic going like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Okay, now and then you just move on. And so it just passes through you, as opposed to like being provocative, like things that shift your perspectives and challenge the way that you think. Like that's actually, I think, the content that we want to search for. And so, you know, for all of Clubhouse's flaws, I mean, it's a 1-year-old platform, so let's be fair. It's 1 year old, 1 year old at this moment in time. There's 10 employees and they have 10 million users. So there's only so much they can realistically do. But what I welcome about Clubhouse is an invitation to listen more than you speak. It's an invitation for you to discover something that you may not have discovered elsewhere. It's also an invitation for you to be better judges of individuals, right? Like, and understand also what you're looking for in your curation of content. It's a slow platform. It's a platform where you waste copious amounts of time because you're actively engaged in the filtering of the knowledge that's going there, and it becomes comfortable when you just settle into the topics that you already know about. And so the comfort is almost a warning sign. So maybe the invitation is less like how do we filter, but just like how do we thrive in spaces of discomfort, and how do we balance that out with the need to obviously not feel incompetent all the time. And to me, it's a personality. I think it's a personality thing. It's something that we can cultivate internally, and then however that manifests can now become the way we interact with Reddit, the way we interact with TikTok, the way we interact with Clubhouse, right? If we change ourselves, then the technologies we use just become tools rather than waiting for the tools to be better at serving us.
That was great, and I think like your notion on technology is just so it's so unique, but I think it's something that is very true in the sense that you're starting to see again. I would not be surprised if other platforms start to mimic similar stuff that the Clubhouse is putting out, because I think on an organic level, it's such a need in this fast-paced internet world that we're in right now, where it's like, aside from podcasts, pretty much, it's hard to really. You can go on the news, watch TV, you're getting just snippets of stuff coming all the time. It's like if you really want to learn some of these complex topics, it takes years of discussion, months of research, and
you have to have conversations with people that know about this stuff. And how else are you going to find them if you're not in universities, or if you're not going to different institutions where you have access to that information?
Yeah, and I think just kind of deregulating that on a global level, where some of these rooms you're having people from all over the world from different backgrounds coming together. I think there's a bit of a power dynamic that will hopefully get ironed out as the platform matures a lot more. But I think beyond that, it really is an opportunity for some people that maybe even are leaders, but have never been provoked with certain questions because in their discipline or wherever they're comfortable in, they've never been asked certain questions or had to, say, I genuinely don't know the answer on this, but let's have a discussion on it and be kind of like human in that sense, where I think really they're so used to like, oh, I'm going to go speak at this event. It's all my peers that I'm used to seeing. Here's kind of like the expected questions that we're going to get. And it really doesn't really lead to any new information. Like you said, it becomes almost like a parrot, and we need to go into uncharted waters pretty much to get new information and find solutions.
Yeah, but the interesting thing when I hear you speak, and like what you're basically describing is a town hall, and like town halls have existed since the dawn of time. So once again, it's like it's not really a lack of it was just a lack of patience. Like we live in this like fast consumption world, and so I'm really excited that Clubhouse managed to introduce it in a format that is now palatable to this current generation, right? But basically they took the concept of a town hall, married it with like a radio station, and then put it onto a phone. It's not that revolutionary when you break it down, right? It's like kind of basic. And it's like, wow, why did it take so long for someone to think about this? And so yeah, and one thing to keep in mind, I think, for anyone who joins Clubhouse, and I wrote an article on this called Dear Clubhouse Virgin, but it's that on Clubhouse, you don't follow people. On every other platform, you follow a person. On Clubhouse, you follow a person's tastes. Follow the kinds of conversations the people you think are smart and interesting are listening in on. And that's how you discover things that you didn't think you would ever be interested in, right? And it's the same thing with a club. Don't follow a club that's going to be talking about marketing success, and then that's all you're going to find is marketing success. So you might as well just sign up for a marketing success YouTube channel, right? Like that's not as interesting. You want to find the clubs that are exploring a broad diversity of topics and intersectionality of topics, which is what I'm trying to do. So plugging myself here, I have a club called Impact Everywhere, and I'm trying to bring people who are having positive impact in unexpected places. And so it's harder to market. Don't get me wrong. I think if this was like a 7-figure success kind of a room, it would attract a lot more people, but maybe it's not about the people, right? Once again, it's not always about having the breadth of impact. It's also about the depth of impact that you can have. So anyways.
From your room, because I've been in your room before too, are there any stories, I don't know if you want to like share anything that has like really resonated with you that you think might be valuable for the listeners?
Oh man. I mean, I've taken so many great conversations offline because I wanted to like have these deepening explorations with people. I think maybe one that comes to mind was a conversation with a lady called Mel Tal. And I don't actually know very much about her. I just like every time she spoke in a room that I was following, I just like gained some insight, and I was like, oh, this girl's really interesting. So I just reached out to her on a DM, and I'm like, hey, can we talk? I didn't like she was talking about feedback loops between the art that is created and like how feedback loops happen. And we ended up talking. She told me about the story of how she created she basically is responsible for lowering the price of organic foods by, I think, 70% in Australia. And she was talking about how for the first year and a half, she struggled really hard to get people to understand the vision. And she made like very little progress. And that it was only after she decided to let things go and stop imposing her ideas onto others and just waited and took a seat back and waited for things to emerge, like sort of like how you might wait for something to float to the surface after you let the water sit for a while, and it was tackling things in that order. And that emergence has been like the major lesson for her in terms of tackling things. And it was such a like a different answer to how I would normally think about tackling impact. And I think it's probably like this masculine energy of saying, oh, there are these problems, I need to solve them, I need to control the situation. And she was like advocating for a completely other thing. So I was like, oh, that's a really interesting, unexpected lesson. I'm going to apply it into my life for this week and see, can I just like chill and like tackle things as they emerge and see what happens? And so my week has now been shaped by this one Clubhouse conversation that was like deepened in a personal conversation. And I have a lot of these sort of moments that maybe don't sound like impact immediately, but then I think they mature, they sit, they marinate, they get explored, and then who knows where it goes from there.
Similar to what we're doing right now with this podcast, I feel like you're giving us so many different insights, and then that'll be extended to so many of our listeners, and it's just like the impact effect where you're just impacting one person after another.
And I think to build on that too, sometimes it's a delayed effect too. So it's like we might have this conversation, Lauren and I, after all said and done, we talk about it a little bit, but then like a week down the road, a month down the road, something might just click and it completely changes the way, because you've now resonated on that level where it's almost like in your subconscious, and like you said, it can just emerge in certain points in time where it's unexpected. So I think that's it's something that I take pride in as well. Like I try to expose myself to different ideas all the time, whether it's a podcast. I mean, I'm not on Clubhouse the way that Lauren is, but believe me, they're going to get on Android soon. I'll get on that. But like exploring all these different ideas, even if they aren't really, I think the way that you were saying it, like focus on interest, like let it be rather broad categories rather than just picking a niche and just only diving in on that, because it's going to cross so many different platforms. It's a much better way to expose yourself to ideas, and in the long run, I think it'll have a greater impact on yourself and open up your ability to impact others as well.
Yeah, for sure. you got to get on Clubhouse, man. You're missing the boat.
I know. I was just saying to my sister, like, I'll probably end up getting like, I have like an old like 5S or something like that. I don't know if it's supported on it, but I'll try to just get like an old.
Yeah. Just save some old phone or iPad from the trash bin. Definitely.
Awesome.
I guess kind of to wrap things up, what we like to do at the end of the podcast is either have you share a really cool stat. I feel like you have a lot of cool stats from like a lot of the artwork that you've done, or if there's a particular story. I don't even know if you want to like get into how you do your artwork, like anything you want.
Yeah.
The floor is kind of yours for a last key takeaway that you think. And also one thing that we can do for you. What value can we bring to you out of this?
Let me rope a statistic into a story. So one of my most successful conservation projects from a metrics perspective was when I put a mermaid on 10,000 plastic bottles. I created this project like completely by fluke because I was in Montreal. It was my sister's wedding. And during that time, my mom found a mermaid tail designer. And I thought, oh, I really want to shoot with this mermaid tail. What can I do that would impact the planet? And I was like, well, where do mermaids swim? Oh, in the ocean. What's wrong with the ocean? Oh, look, plastics. And then that's when I dove into plastics. And so I created this series. It got 37 million views on Facebook, and it's been spread on like newspapers all over the world. And those are only the views on like my native video. So I actually don't know how many views it has. I don't know how many people have seen the photograph because we can't track these things. And so that's something that's like a point of major frustration, because part of me goes like, wait, great. I created this thing on paper. It was a massive success. But what has changed? Well, since I made that, plastic production is at an all-time high, just as plastic awareness is at an all-time high. So effectively, did awareness lead to change? Not really. So, part of me kicks myself in the butt. But then sometimes like random things happen. Like yesterday, like literally yesterday, I got an email. I got a Google News alert from a Vice article where which had my name in it. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. I didn't do an interview recently. What is this about? And I click on this Vice News article, and it was an interview about an entrepreneur in China, in Wuhan, China, who, because she saw my photographs, was inspired to start a company that now hires 10 employees to like make bags out of recycled plastic bottles. And I'm like, huh? This is one story that I've heard of and one story that I've seen. And I just wonder how many stories like this exist out there. And, for any listener who decides to like go and check out Mermaid on plastic bottles or Mermaid Von Wong, it might trigger something in them. It might trigger something in their kids. I don't know. But like as the engineering side of me is just like, I want to know, where all this stuff is going. I want to know what is it impacting people? Is it worth it? Is it worth the time, energy, and effort? Is it worth the carbon footprint and cost of creating something like this? Because I don't have anything to measure it against, right? And every time you do a project, you never know if it's actually going to work. You never know if it's actually going to resonate. And so it's like the lack of feedback loop is something I personally struggle with. But then, then you have this like one little qualitative story that just slaps you on the head out of nowhere. And you're just like, huh, maybe I should keep doing it. And so, yeah, I guess that's maybe like an interesting story for you guys. With regards to what you can do to help, I don't know. I have so many requests. Maybe I should just make them all in case anyone's interested. So maybe the most interesting, maybe one request that might be relevant to the way this conversation has unfolded. By the way, I really loved this interview. I feel like there were some really interesting things that were uncovered, and it was not too much about my life, which I really like. Is that I think as creative people and as human beings in general, we have our peaks and our valleys. And very often when we're at our lows, we feel just like miserable, and then something happens and suddenly we're high. And we're the exact same person, but we feel completely different. And when you're high, you can dispense all this valuable advice to the world, to your friends, to your partners, to yourself, and you can justify the reason you're at this high point. And then when you're low, you're just like, oh my gosh, I got it all wrong, da da da. And I've been thinking it would be really interesting to kind of write a book that would kind of collect all of these lessons into one place, into sort of a little field guide, so that I can talk to myself, but maybe others can talk to themselves too. So that they can remember the lessons that they knew but forgot about, between those two timeframes. And so it's a book I'd like to write, but I'm not a writer. I'm actually very much a verbal processor, so I can speak about things and I can't write it down. So if anyone wants to help me write this thing, I need help. So that's the first request. Secondly, I also have a podcast called Impact Everywhere. It explores positive impact in unexpected places. I've been porting a lot of those conversations onto Clubhouse and trying to figure out how these two work. And I guess I don't really want followers or listeners per se. It's just that if those are the kinds of things that you're interested in, if you want to hear from NASA scientists, human trafficking survivors, a game designer that talks about the benefits of fiction, a chef that talks about how he's using food as an opportunity to educate people about homelessness, and if you like these sort of interstitial conversations, I just love for you to listen to the podcast and just like let me know that you've listened to something and that you've appreciated something, because once again, that feedback loop is really hard to come by. And so I think I'll just leave it at those two. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. It was such a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast. If you would like to learn more, visit us at www.last20.ca. Until next time, stay sustainable.